May I now invite Mr. CK Ranganathan, Senior Vice President, AIMA, and Chairman and Managing Director, Cabin Care Private Limited, to open the session with his introductory remarks.
Nitin Nohria, Distinguished Service University Professor, Harvard University and former Dean, Harvard Business School. V Mohandas Pai, Chairman, Manipal Global Education Services. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have you all with us today, and a very warm welcome to a conversation with Professor Nitin Nohria, Distinguished Service Professor of Harvard University and the former Dean of Harvard Business School. Professor Nohria, it's a privilege to have you on the AIMA platform, and many thanks for agreeing to do this session. You have been a transformative teacher and leader at Harvard, and you have steered the institution through a period of great turmoil and change in the world. You were in the first Indian-American Dean of Harvard School of Business, and your outstanding achievements have greatly enhanced the brand equity of Indian talent in the US academic world. You brought a new flavor to business education and introduced the field curriculum to the MBA program as well as online certificate programs. You also instituted the iLab to promote business innovations by students. You integrated the business school activities with the rest of the Harvard University and oversaw the launch of the dual degree programs with the engineering, the medical, and the arts department of the university. Thank you for joining us, and a very warm welcome to you. Mohan, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for agreeing to moderate the conversation with Professor Nohria. You chair Manipal Global Education, and you are deeply interested in human resource development even during your years at Infosys. You have always been deeply involved in founding the AIMA India Case Research Center for developing Indian case studies for both Indian students and foreign B schools. You are a leading investor in India's startup, and you are mentoring many of them, including those in the edutech sector. You have always been a key figure in policy making and governance during the past few years. You have been a member of India's stock market regulator, SEBI, and various government committees on taxation reforms. We look forward to an exciting conversation between you and Professor Nohria. Thank you for joining us, and a very warm welcome to you. Ladies and gentlemen, management education has changed dramatically since the 2008 financial crisis, and there has been a shift towards sensitizing MBAs to the interest of all stakeholders and not just serve the shareholders. The growth struggles through the 2010s and the beginning of 2020s with the global pandemic and economic disruption has further highlighted the need for a change in the role of business and business education. Since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, businesses have been called to repurpose their assets and organization to help deal with pervasive sickness and death. Executives who are trained for increasing revenues and minimizing costs have to pivot to add public and employee health into the mix. They had to rethink supply chain and product innovations to deliver solutions to the survival needs of the population instead of discretionary sophistication. Some businesses measured up to the task, and the opportunities some struggled to just stay afloat. One big lesson for enterprises from the pandemic has been that they have to include their social purpose in their larger business strategy and vision, and not so much because of the altruism, but because of evading disruption and capturing windfall opportunities. Even as the world recovers to some semblance of normalcy, business leaders have to factor in the change priorities of their stakeholders and align the organizations with the moral compass of the society also. It is not enough to declare good intention and do social marketing. To be competitive in the post-pandemic world, businesses need to score on multiple metrics, including employee wages and welfare, diversity and inclusion in both workforce and leadership, social and national contribution, public health, and financial climate change mitigation. Meeting all these obligations will create tremendous complexity and strain management bandwidth and resources. But there is no other way, and this ought to be done to have a future in business. This is where management education has to evolve quickly and provide the talent with the appropriate skills and mentality to thrive in the new business world. I'm sure we will learn a lot by listening to Professor Nohria, who has done some outstanding thinking and teaching in this area. With these words, it's my pleasure to invite Mohan to take over and conduct the session. Thank you.
Thank you, CK. Thank you, folks, for being here. And thank you, Professor Nohria. Professor Nohria, you have been at the forefront of reconfiguring global business to meet the needs of society. You have demonstrated that business has to be compassionate, business has to follow a different kind of capitalism. If you look around the world today, post-pandemic, what are the challenges of today's capitalistic world? Is society worldwide losing trust in business? Do they still have the same trust they had possibly when you started your career?
Thank you, Mr. Pai, and thank you, Mr. Ranganathan, for including me. It's a privilege for me to be a part of this AIMA gathering again. My father, Nitin Nohria, has been a long-time friend of AIMA, so it is a true privilege as his son to now have this opportunity to speak to this august group. So as you, Mr. Pai, so correctly point out, the pandemic, on the one hand, one might say it's an acute crisis because it's a disease which hopefully will be behind us. But I think the pandemic has revealed to us very deep structural crises in society. So if you think about what the pandemic has proven everywhere in the world, even where there is recovery, the recovery is K-shaped. The rich seem to have gotten richer through the pandemic, and the poor seem to have struggled even more. The pictures as an Indian that one saw of migrant workers who already have barely live on subsistence levels, having their lives be put at great risk during the pandemic are not just Indian pictures. You can see similar stories in the United States. You can see similar stories everywhere in the world. So we seem to be living in an economy in which there is a tremendous amount of innovation. On the one hand, you have vaccines developed in record time. So you can see that it's not that business as a force itself is not humming. The internet, if it wasn't for the internet, generations of students would have had no opportunity to study. All of us would not have the opportunity to continue our activities as we're doing on this Zoom format. So while there's a lot that is good that is going on in business, its benefits don't seem to be accruing evenly to society. And I think that's something that we need to worry about a lot, because in the end, society's faith in business comes from the fact that over a long period of time, business is good for all. It raises the living standards and the income and the well-being and the prosperity of all members of society. Now, inequality has always been a feature of society. So I don't think that society is inherently uncomfortable with inequality. If someone works 10 hours and I work 1, I am not troubled if they earn more than me. If someone goes to university and I don't, I'm not troubled if they earn a little bit more than me. But what troubles me is if, despite my best efforts, I feel like my condition in life is stuck. And I think we're facing a society that has too much of that everywhere in the world. That's one of the things that we need to fix. The other thing which, of course, happened during the pandemic that many of us may have ignored because we were so preoccupied with the pandemic is that the last 2 years have also been a year in which there's been the greatest number of climate-related adverse events in the world. In the US, where I live, there are wildfires literally every day. We just had another hurricane Ida, that was of the same strength as Katrina. And again, these are not US problems. These are problems everywhere in the world. If you look across the world, there have been climate events have increased to a greater extent. And that's another problem that if you see who it affects, while it affects all of us, so that is one that will affect all of us, even that problem tends to affect the poor more than it affects the rich. So take the state of Louisiana. The poor in Louisiana have barely recovered from Hurricane Katrina, and now they've had Hurricane Ida hit them too. They're the ones who have very little insurance, so when their properties get destroyed, they have to rely upon the state and they can't help themselves. So I think if you look at the big issues in society today, we as business people need to recognize that these issues are our issues. if we want to maintain trust in society, which is essential for businesses' long-term success, addressing these social issues of inequality and of climate change, I will mention those two in particular because I think there are many others we could talk about as well. But those two, I think, are the two big issues that we as business leaders have to find a way of tackling.
Mr. Nohria, that's very, very relevant, and I totally agree with you. But there is one more thing that's happening around the world, and that is technology and accelerated innovation. This has increased the divide between the rich and other sections of society. You've seen the rich get richer, particularly in the last 2 years in COVID because of technology innovation. You've seen $2.5 trillion companies coming up. Now, when this happened, society asked those business leaders, what are you doing for us? Now, do you see this trend going forward of an accelerating divide because of technology and accelerated innovation? Do you think business is losing more of its moral compass and the ability to make the future better for all? We had calls in society for an increase in the minimum wages, for example, in the United States. At the same time, the people who benefited from technology innovations who become billionaires many times over are a bit hesitant to step up to the plate and take care of them. So do you think technology and innovation are accelerating the divide, and we need to have a much, much better focus on understanding this change and coming out with some kind of solutions?
Mr. Pai, I think you're absolutely correct that the current technologies that we are seeing, in particular technologies that are associated with the internet, tend to be technologies in which a lot of value can be created by a small number of people. Unlike where you have to employ, to scale many, many more people, these businesses scale with relatively fewer addition of people. It's not like they don't have to add people now. Amazon and others have become very large, hundreds of thousands of employers companies. But for the most part, the productivity per employee is much higher in an internet company than it was in a traditional manufacturing company, certainly much more than in an agricultural sector company or even in a service sector company. Some of this productivity are, of course, accruing to the people who were the entrepreneurs of this generation of companies. And so as a result, you're seeing at a time, people estimate that 100 people in the world may have become more wealthy than the bottom 20% of society aggregately through the internet revolution. This, of course, even if I, as a farmer, am grateful for a cell phone, which connects me to the rest of the world, so I don't think we should be critical of the technology. The technology itself has had profoundly beneficial consequences, not just for the rich, but I think for all of society. I think what we have to ask ourselves is, how do we make sure that this prosperity over time is more inclusive? It is often the case that in the early phases of any technology, inequality rises, whether it was the Industrial Revolution. So if you look at the stories, the great Dickens story of A Tale of Two Cities, you're reminded of the fact that early on in the Industrial Revolution, inequality was high. And then through a series of both regulation and business itself thinking about doing good things, we found that prosperity could be increased. So people often think that the minimum wage was introduced by the government. The actual minimum wage was first introduced by Henry Ford, who decided to voluntarily increase the wages of his employees in his assembly plant, because he said that tomorrow these employees, I need them and they're going to become my consumers as well. So actually their well-being is not just a cost to me, it's over time creating a customer for me, right? So I think that type of mentality, which is an important orientation that he had a long time ago, is an important orientation that we need to have. By the way, I do think that the promise of this new technology to democratize many things that were previously only in the province of those who were more privileged should not be underestimated. Take education, which is a field that you and I both care about. I think we're in the very early innings of what technology could do or how technology could be leveraged to make a higher quality education accessible to many, many more people in the world. It takes a generation, of course, for technology's benefits. So I look at my own family. It was my father who was the first in his family to get a real high quality education. And you can see the benefits now in my generation and in my children too. So I hope that we'll start to see these benefits of technology as it aims to try and create more prosperity for more people, as opposed to in the early days, just creating something that is very useful, but in which the riches or in which the benefits accrue to a few.
Professor Nohria, we spoke about the gap in trust between business and society. We spoke about the need for business to get involved in solving global challenges. We spoke about innovation and technology accelerating the difference between the rich, very rich, and the poor. Now, in your view, as a professor of business management, professor of business who has taught business, who has spoken to many business managers, what should business leaders do to increase the trust of society in business, in tackling global challenges, and mitigating the negative impact of technology innovation in accelerating the divide? What should they do? What kind of a business leader do you want to see in future?
So I think first and foremost, business leaders have to recognize that these problems, which in economic theory have sometimes been called externalities, right? So climate is called an externality. It's something that is not my problem, it's a collective problem, and therefore society has to take care of it. Or the focus of a business is, let me drive my technology and let me become as productive as I can. There's a competitive market for labor, so I should pay my labor the least I can, because in the end, that's the best way for me to be the most competitive in business. I think these are ideas that we will need to reimagine. And we will need to reimagine them creatively. We can't just dismiss these ideas, because in the end, it is in fact the case that we'll have to think very hard about how can we increase the wages of our labor force without becoming unproductive. Because if you become unproductive or uncompetitive, or if your cost structure increases, then you do not survive as a business. And if you do not survive as a business, I don't think you do any good to anybody, right? So I think that it's important for business people to realize that they have to do well and do good. They can't choose one over the other, because if you don't do well as a business, over time you fail, in which case you're doing no good to anybody. But if you only do well and you don't do good, I think you have a problem as well. So I remember a good example that I have, which has become one that increasingly I've been thinking about, is, for the longest time, nobody used to say that I produce poor quality products. Everybody used to say I produce high quality products. And yet it used to be the case that people were hesitant to produce high quality because everybody thought that high quality was associated with higher costs. It took the Japanese, building on a set of ideas that were both Japanese and American ideas, whether it was Deming and others, to create an entire set of ideas and then management practices, not just a set of ideas, but a set of rigorous management practices. It started off in vanguard companies like Toyota. We started to teach at Harvard Business School the Toyota production system. Now everywhere in the world, we understand this as lean manufacturing. And what we learned over time was that for a very large range of quality, you could produce higher quality and reduce costs. Right? So there was no particular reason why we used to think of higher quality as inevitably associated with higher costs. It is breaking this kind of fixedness, which is where we start to associate the improvement of something with higher costs, that we as business leaders will have to imaginatively confront. So take the environment, right? 10 years ago, after Katrina, Walmart decided, because it faced the challenge of Katrina, to say, we're going to somehow or the other reduce our carbon footprint by a significant amount, right? At that point, they had thought that they would reduce it by 10%. And their estimate at that time was that by reducing their carbon footprint by that much, they would have to increase costs. Now, since Walmart has devoted its entire business model is to give people the goods and services that they need at an everyday low price, there was actually a real moral conflict that is created. Like, how do we navigate our business on the one side in which we think we're going to increase costs, which is bad for our customers, and simultaneously reduce our environmental footprint, which we think is good for the entire planet, but not just for our customers, right? But they said, nevertheless, it's a moral imperative and we should take this on. Over the last 10 years, what Walmart discovered is that if it put its own ingenuity to work, rather than having its costs rise, its costs actually reduced by virtue of taking on the challenge of reducing its carbon footprint. Inspired by that, they now have this, let's take 1 gigaton of carbon out of Walmart. It has inspired many other companies to think the same way. We now need to take, just like we did with the Toyota production system, some of the ideas that have been developed here, systematize them, find a way so that many, many more people can embrace them. And that's an example of how we could break this trade-off that has historically been seen, that the only way in which I can reduce the carbon footprint of my business is by increasing its costs. I actually think that we have to, in this next decade, find a way in which we can, as we did with the quality movement, and AIMA was a big part of it, is to simultaneously find a way of tackling these social problems and then figuring out the ideas and the management practices while lowering its costs. You can see that there are companies in the US that have become a part of a living wage coalition. Yes. So they are all saying that not just minimum wages, we actually have to pay our workers what is considered a decent living wage. And then we have to think about productivity improvements that we can have, or believe that by treating our employees that well, they will be more productive and they will do more for the firm. There'll be lower turnover, there'll be lower training costs. So we can actually find a way over time to reduce the cost structure of the firm, even as we raise the wages of our people. I think it's that type of imagination that is essential for business leaders. And we already have business leaders who are, I would say, at the vanguard of this. And I hope that over time we will learn from them and diffuse these practices much more broadly in society.
Professor Nohria, that is very, very hopeful. But tell me, Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has demonstrated through his book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, or something, that, capital is getting an increasingly higher share of value add than labor. It seems to be an irreversible flow towards the future. Now, with technology, that's happening more. Now, are you saying that with compassionate capitalism and the business having the need to get the trust of society back and paying a living wage, this could possibly be rebalanced so that we get a better society? I mean, is that the case that one could make based upon what business leaders are doing, what people like you are teaching, are writing about, and people like you are creating public opinion on?
So look, I am of the view that we must be very careful in trying to reform capitalism, to not lose capitalism. I would say that capitalism is a tremendous force for opportunity in the world, and is one of the few sustainable ways in which society can create prosperity for each other. So what is a business? A business at its core is someone who has an idea for creating something for value for society. Voluntarily, people have to consume that product, but I can't force my product down someone's throat. So it's a voluntary exchange between a consumer who says that for a certain price, what you're giving me as a business, I think it's a good business, right? And so there's an exchange there that is good. Similarly, investors have to decide to give their money to a business because they believe that the business will give them a fair return. A community has to agree to have a business get a license to operate in that society, to give it a presence in the society, because it believes that this business will be good for my community, right? If in the end business fails to do any of these things, if customers feel that this business is not giving me something that is worth the price of what I pay, they will find some other business, they will stop working with the business will become bankrupt. So business, what I love about business as an institution and why I have devoted my life to business is that I think of it as being one of the greatest inventions of society, where voluntarily we can organize a system of exchange that benefits us all. Now, it is possible for business to extract so much power that it engages in monopoly pricing over its customers, which is a very bad practice. Or as we see today with technology, that it can addict us to biased information because that is good for the business. So it's not the case that business is always lives within this guidelines of free and open exchange. But it is important to remember that a system of free and open exchange, which is what capitalism tries to advance, is at its core a better system than believing that the government or someone else can decide what I need to consume or how much to invest or anything like that. So I think that as business people, we should be devoted to reforming business, to trying to correct some of the problems that Mr. Piketty and others have observed. But I think it would be a very big mistake if we lost faith that in the end, capitalism and business is the best social invention for creating prosperity for a very, very large part of society.
I think that is very incisive. Now, it leads to another natural question which some of our viewers are asking us. That is, what is the role of government and the civil society, which is increasingly becoming much more visible in working with business to solve large societal problems? Because government thinks of itself as the regulator, protector of consumers, but civil society has come up in a very big way. They've become a very, very big force as a counterbalance to the government and maybe business. How can all three, business, civil society, government, work together in the new paradigm?
So the government has a very, very important role to play. It's like in any sport, any game, you need the rules of the sport to have even good competition amongst people, right? So government's job is to create the rules of the game and to make sure that the rules of the game are fair and fair for all parties involved, right? So just as I said, business is at its essence a nexus of relationships between customers, investors, workers, managers, and communities, right? To make sure that this interaction occurs in a way in which everybody feels that they were dealt with fairly, that is the fundamental role of government. And that's where government, I think, plays a powerful role. The question is, what does sensible regulation look like? I think we all know that regulation can be very sensible. Regulation can overreach, but there can also be under-regulation. So for example, some people believe, and I think I am one of those, that there is probably under-regulation in the tech sector in the United States, and we can now see some regulation begin to arise. But there are many, many things in which there can be over-regulation, which is not very good for anybody actually in the end, because in the end, government is also there to serve society. So it's important to remember that government has no interests other than the interests of society as a whole. I think the role that civic and civil service organizations and civil society organizations are playing right now is really extraordinary. So you think about the environmental movement. I don't think that without organizations in civil society, the wide variety of environmental organizations that at one point we used to think were almost revolutionary, Greenpeace and others. I mean, if it wasn't for people like that, I don't think we would have been alerted to the tremendous challenges that we now face in society. Even at Walmart, over the last 10 years, what Walmart learned is that it required them to form an alliance with environmental organizations so that they could learn what it was that they did not understand about how to make their environmental impact lower in the world. So in my humble opinion, the future in terms of restoring prosperity for society will require much more active collaboration between business, government, and civil society. We have to stop seeing each other as having different interess, but to recognize that we actually have a shared interest in creating prosperity and well-being in the long run for society. And more, you're starting to see these partnerships that are emerging between government, civil society organizations, and businesses. This Walmart example that I used is one that I really like because, and there are many more, so you're beginning to see these examples emerge in which people are showing that to tackle these big social issues, you can't do it on your own. You have to engage people in civil society who know the problems better than you might as a business person. You have to then engage government to say what does sensible regulation look like that doesn't just advantage you individually, but creates a fair playing field for everyone involved. And I think the more we can adopt this mindset and then start to develop practices that take that mindset and actually show us real examples of how to put it to use, that's where I think that we have more hope going forward.
Now, Professor Nohria, another interesting question from our viewers. You are a professor of business. You have been a professor of business for many years. You've seen business shape. You've seen new things come up. You have been in the forefront of business thought. You've seen many of the people you taught become business leaders. Now, at this point of time, what can business education do to create managers through the business schools and through people like you who can meet the challenges that you just elucidated? The big challenge society, the growing gap between rich and poor, the need for innovation, the need to regain trust, the need to make sure that society keeps together. But they have to be done by people who graduate from your business school. So what are you doing to make sure that you are able to create this great product?
We certainly need to do what we can to help our graduates from our business school be better stewards of this relationship between business and society. But let me just say that we educate a very small fraction of all of the business leaders in the world. So my hope is that one of the reasons that I'm so proud to be associated with AIMA in some ways is that here's a whole organization that is devoted to the advancement of management in India. And so I think that there's a very powerful and important role for not just business schools, but for anybody else who's involved in management education or in management development or in the development of business leaders everywhere in the world. So after there's around the time of our centennial, which was in 2008, this is 100 years of the history of Harvard Business School. My current dean and former colleague Srikant Datar and David Garvin wrote a book called Reimagining the MBA. Mm-hmm. In that book, they came up with a very simple set of ideas. They had a framework which said that business education or business leadership is about knowing, doing, and being. Knowing is to master a body of knowledge. Doing is then to translate that body of knowledge into action. And being is to carry yourself in a way, which is to be a business leader in a way that earns the trust of the people that you work with and society at large. So their view was that business education in its first 100 years had done a pretty good job on the knowing dimension. So over 100 years, frankly, across all business schools, nobody teaches CAPM differently. So in fact, they said the knowing of business has gotten quite commoditized. We have, in fact, developed a body of knowledge, which if you go across the world, you'll see most business schools teach at least a curriculum that has something that is more in common than not. They said there's a big distance still between knowing and doing. There's a lot of people who have book knowledge, but they can't translate that book knowledge into action. And so the field program that we launched at Harvard Business School was an attempt to try and to inculcate more action learning. This is not a new idea, right? The case method was not a new idea at Harvard Business School either, but we wanted to systematize action learning. We wanted to systematize what it means by learning by doing, so whether this is project-oriented work or going out into the field, we wanted to create more progress on doing. But we felt that, okay, business education has at least learned something about doing. Where Srikant and David Garvin felt that business education was weakest was in inculcating being, which is to imbue in our students the values of what it meant to be a great steward of business and society. I think we've made progress in the last 10 years on moving business education from knowing to put more emphasis on doing and some emphasis on being. Ironically, I think that we now live in a moment in which our students may be ahead of us on being. Because I actually think that the young generation comes to us with values where they are almost demanding that we teach them more about how they can, in fact, enact these values, which I think they're more environmentally conscious, they're more conscious of inequalities, they're more conscious of trying to live in a world because probably they see the existential risk in their generation. But what will happen if business doesn't change much more than our generation saw the risk? In some ways, we're going to likely die before climate change becomes an existential threat. But for this generation that is currently in our schools, if this problem doesn't get tackled, they might inherit a world which looks like a very dystopian world. So I think they maybe see the challenges more clearly and more viscerally than we do. But I think now we don't know what the ideas are that we should teach them. So, you know, we can teach them these values. So, for example, I don't know how to teach students if you wanted to reduce, if you wanted to be, you know, suppose you made a declaration that you want to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2050 or whatever date you've chosen. So, you know, zero carbon initiatives have been launched by companies. But what do we know to teach to allow companies to reliably do that in a way that will be effective and sustainable? What is the modern day equivalent of teaching them the Toyota production system, or teaching them lean manufacturing principles, or teaching them Kaizen, or teaching them all of those things that we used to teach when they came to our technology and operations management class? In the 1980s and the 1990s, we could teach them, how do you improve your quality while reducing costs? So I actually think that there is, in addition to continuing to emphasize the being of business and to make sure that there is another generation of business leaders who are acutely aware of and sensitive to and devoted to using their lives to solve these big social issues while still running great businesses, I actually think that we now have to accelerate the rate at which we are producing the next generation of knowledge that can inform these good intentions and make sure that these good intentions can be translated into reliable management practice. That, I think, is the real challenge of business education now.
Thank you, Professor Nohria. That's very, very useful and very incisive. Now, my last question to you as you wind up this excellent talk. You know, you have seen business for the past very many years. You are the forefront of management thought. In the last 2 years, you've seen a once-in-a-century pandemic, the impact on society. As a concerned person, compassionate person, you've been concerned at what is happening. You've seen climate change coming up, global challenges coming up. And after so many years, the challenges have only grown. So what makes you most concerned about the future? And what makes you feel more hopeful that the future will be better despite these big challenges?
So what concerns me the most is that one thing I've learned is that the human capacity for forgetting is infinite. In some ways, it's a good thing, right? In some ways, it's a very productive thing, because if you wallow in the miseries of the past, you will permanently be a miserable person. So I think the fact that, you know, we recover from the deaths of loved ones, that just tells you that there may be something very deeply in our evolutionary makeup almost that causes us to forget pain and to look for hope very quickly. So I worry that, you know, at some point, once the pandemic is behind us, or as has happened in the US just recently with Hurricane Ida, which did not cause the same devastation that Katrina did, that we just say, you know, these are not big problems, we know how to tackle them, let's get on with business as usual, and we all kind of return to doing the things that we used to do, and forget that there are big lurking structural problems, and while the storm of today may have passed, there's an underlying set of issues that are still brewing that is going to cause the next storm and the next storm and the next storm. So we may get past this pandemic, but there's a set of structural things that are going on in the world that make it more likely that we might have another one. This particular storm may have passed, but there are other ones that might come. So somehow we need to make sure that we don't forget. So that's the thing that worries me the most, which is, I hope we don't forget that these things have now become so much a part of our lives that we will become a generation that does not forget these things and in fact takes them seriously. So that's the kind of, the hopeful part that I have is that I do see, I am a deep believer in innovation. So I think that innovation is in the end the reason why we should feel hopeful. And this is not just innovation in technologies, which I think are very important and profound. And I think we're in the early ages of a golden era of innovation in technology. What the vaccines did in terms of 1 year, I think there are many, many more platforms like mRNA, which I think, for example, promise to improve human health in dramatic ways in the next 10, 20 years. I think there are technologies that we're seeing, whether it's what we're seeing with electric batteries and other kinds of environmental technologies, which now there's enough demand for. So I think we are going to see a next 10, 20 years of amazing technologies that will enable more sustainability. So in area upon area, I feel very hopeful that technology will play a big role. And happily, with venture capital and a celebration of entrepreneurs that has occurred culturally in society, I think we're actually in a period which is a good period to not suppress these entrepreneurs, but to enable these entrepreneurs. So despite their wealth, please don't get envious of the wealth of entrepreneurs. I think our hope lies with them, and we should continue to be betting on them to produce answers that will be beneficial for society. And then I think the other thing that I'm hopeful about is that I have always believed that given a very difficult problem, business leaders, in terms of their own business models, can be extraordinary innovators as well. And I will repeat again this example that is one of my favorite examples of the Toyota production system. That was a business innovation. There was less technology innovation in it than there was business innovation. I think we need a period of business innovation as well, in which people can show, as business leaders, how they can marshal these technologies, how they can marshal this moment to, in fact, give us examples which then become examples that inspire and create more widespread practice of ways in which business can be a better force for society. So if we don't forget and we continue to apply our ingenuity, our imagination, and our innovation, and we remember that in the end, business does well when society does well, and society does well when business does well. And we understand this genuine mutual interdependence that business has with society. I think that still makes me feel optimistic about the future.
Professor Nohria, I think this is wonderful. We had a great discussion, incisive thoughts on business and society. I want to thank you very much for this wonderful discussion, and look forward to engaging with you better. I do hope that we'll have many more occasions for you to address some members of AIMA. Thank you very much, folks, for being here. Thank you, Professor Nohria.